Gonzalo Lira is one of our most widely watched guests. And last week, the mother of all talk shows was watched by 1.1 million people. I suspect we might even break that this week. No least thanks to Gonzalo Lira, who joins me now. Gonzalo, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Very glad that you are safe and well, because it's all kicking off near where you are, isn't it?
Yeah, the war is turning in a very, very interesting direction, and I think that we've reached a turning point and that it won't continue much longer. Because the situation on the ground, insofar as what the Western media is saying, is that, the Zelensky regime's forces are on the doors of Moscow, but that's nonsense. Over the past 6 weeks, they've launched a series of offensives along the three fronts, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Kharkov. And these offensives have been incredibly costly. They have lost so many lives. And the only quote-unquote victory that the Zelensky regime claimed and made a lot of hay out of was the offensive in Kharkov, in the Kharkov region. But when you actually look at what happened, the Zelensky regime forces essentially took open cow country, and there's nothing there, but they lost an enormous number of soldiers. It's credibly estimated that in the past 6 weeks, they have lost at least 18,000 men killed, and perhaps twice that number seriously wounded, incapacitated. And now they have assembled in two focal points. The focal point number one is the Battle of Bakhmut, which is a town. It's in the Lugansk region, and it's a key point of intersection of several rail lines and highways. Whoever grabs that city, which is in dispute right now, there's a fierce battle going on. It's been going on for a number of weeks. Well, once the Russian forces capture that town, they are going to be able to what's known as flower out, because there are several roads that exit from Bakhmut. And so that seems that the Russian forces are going to be taking that town in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at most, but they will take it. The Wagner forces, which are the private military contractors that the Russian use, they're basically shock troops. They are on the outskirts of the city. Rumors say that they are actually in control of the southern half of the city, but there's fierce combat going on right now, so nobody's very clear about it. But it's indisputable that that city will be captured. And the issue is, of course, that there are 30,000 Zelensky regime forces there. And on the other hand, there is a very large grouping of Zelensky regime forces that are amassing around the city of Kherson, or just across from the city of Kherson. And they are about to launch, and in fact, as I'm speaking to you now, they are launching, as a matter of fact, a major offensive towards the city of Kherson. Now, the city of Kherson, if you recall, it was captured initially at the beginning of the war by the Russians. It was a very important operational objective, because they wanted to break the dam that was preventing Crimea from getting water. And so they captured it initially, and they've held on to it this whole time very easily. And it was the first city where they implemented the use of the ruble. It was the first city where they started giving out Russian passports to the citizenry there. And now the Zelensky regime has amassed an estimated army of between 30,000 and 60,000 men, though the 60,000 seems a little bit over the top. It's more credible to say it's probably between the 30 and 40,000 man range. And they are going to launch a major offensive. They are, as I said, launching it as I speak. And this offensive, the issue is that, the best frontline troops that the Kiev regime had, they're gone. That army that they started the war with of 240,000 men, those combat troops have been destroyed. The men that the Kiev regime is throwing into the mix now that are going to be attacking from Kherson are what is known as territorial defense forces. These are second and third tier forces. They are under-equipped, under-trained, and basically it's going to be a human wave type of attack, which will be horrifying. It will be incredibly bloody, especially because the Kherson area where they are going to be attacking has been fortified over the last 7-8 months now by the Russians. So they're basically going to be throwing these waves of people against a solid wall. And it's going to be horrifying. And the thing is, see, a lot of people in the West, especially NATO, they insist that this offensive has to take place. It is very clear that Washington wants this offensive to take place before the midterm elections, which are on, I believe, the 7th of November. And so they are insisting that the Kiev regime throw these men into this battle for the city of Kherson, which is actually quite far away from the actual front lines. And these men are going to be slaughtered. And it's as simple as that. It's a tragedy, and it's being done for optics and the politics in the United States. And what has to be understood is that, you see, even if these waves of soldiers manage to advance somehow, and perhaps even take the city of Kherson, the Russians have already shown their absolute willingness to give up territory and evacuate their troops as well as civilians to save their men and save their equipment. And as they retreat, they inflict punishing losses on the attacking forces. Because, of course, when you are attacking, especially in the kind of terrain we're talking about here, which is steppe, it's just flat prairie land, well, when you attack, you expose yourself. And so these men who are going to be attacking towards the direction of Kherson, they're going to be exposed, just as what happened in Kharkov. In the town of Izium and the town of Liman, which is in the Kharkov region, the Zelensky regime forces attacked with everything. And the Russians simply pulled out. And they secured the vast majority of their men, the vast majority of their equipment. And as they retreated, they inflicted with their artillery and air power terrifying losses. It is credibly estimated that the Kharkov offensive cost the lives, not casualties, lives of at least 6,000 Zelensky regime forces, and the Russians suffered less than 100. I mean, it was that lopsided. And so, in the West, they are talking about, that the Zelensky regime forces are going to break through to Kherson and they're going to go on the road to Crimea. This is nonsensical. They point in the West, in the Western media, the prostitute media of the West. They claim that the Russians are evacuated civilians because they believe that they're going to lose Kherson. That's not the reason. The reason they are evacuating civilians is that they know that the Zelensky regime forces are going to fire indiscriminately into the city of Kherson using those famous HIMARS missiles to inflict damage on the civilian population, as they have been doing for the last 8 years in the city of Donetsk. And so all of this attack on the city of Kherson, it'll probably destroy the city. And so that's why they removed all the civilians. Because quite frankly, as an army, it's just easier not to have civilians around so you can go ahead with your operations. And as I said, if the Russians feel that these advances are gaining ground, they will simply pull back. Because you have to understand a key issue. The Ukrainians have run out of men, and they are rapidly running out of weaponry. Why do you think they are going to the West begging for all kinds of weapons, whatever weapons they can get? Because they have simply run out, because, of course, those weapons have been destroyed. The original army has been destroyed. The only people who are fighting are territorial defense forces and also a lot of NATO contractors, because all of these foreign weapon systems that are being operated in Ukraine, well, it takes months to train for these weapons. And so it's impossible to get Ukraine soldiers to train on them as a practical matter in terms of time. And so the people operating this equipment have been NATO contractors. Probably they were NATO officers for the British, the French, the Greek, the American army last week. And then they just, quote unquote, resigned and signed the paper. And now they're private military contractors, and they're sent to Ukraine to operate these HIMARS systems, the M777s and whatnot. And so that's what you have fighting there. And these men are going to be decimated. It's going to be a slaughter. And even if they gain ground, which is a doubtful thing, but even if they do, swarming, sort of like zombies in one of those apocalyptic movies, well, they will eventually exhaust themselves. They will run out of men. And then the Russians will simply bend back and move forward. In fact, Lyman, which was the town that the Ukrainian armed forces captured 2-3 weeks ago, the Russians now are staging offensives on that town to recapture it. And they're fresh whereas the Zelensky regime forces that are currently defending Lyman, they're exhausted. And so this is the war that's being fought. And the people in the West, the vast majority of civilians, not people like you and I who are neck deep in the information warfare, well, the people in the West do not seem to realize that all of their woes are not because of Russia. It's because of the Western leadership classes that bet it all on the Zelensky regime and defeating Russia. And they bet wrong. And they did all these sanctions that have backfired on them horribly. And that's why the people in Britain are going to go cold, dark, and hungry this winter. And I know that you're in the UK, and sincerely, I hope that things work out for you personally, George, because you know how much I appreciate you. But I'm telling you, it's going to be an ugly winter for the people of Europe, and they only have their own leadership to blame. Your leadership, the European leadership, is going to blame Putin, but it wasn't Putin that didn't want to negotiate. It wasn't Putin that cut off the supply of gas. It was the West, the Americans, who decided not to negotiate, that they were only going to accept total victory and regime change in Russia. It was the West, the EU, the British government of Boris Johnson and now Liz Truss, and the Biden administration, who all insisted on these draconian sanctions that only hurt the European people. And on top of that, as a final note, sort of like a cherry on the sundae, you have the fact that the Americans blew up the Nord Stream pipeline in a grotesque act of terrorism, and they have the gall to try to blame it on the Russians, when we all know, everyone knows, that the Americans did it, likely with the assistance of the United Kingdom and perhaps Poland, and it is going to push the European economy off a cliff. In fact, it already has. I mean, the European economy is already collapsing. It's already gone off the cliff. Now we're just waiting for the final splat when it hits the bottom, okay? And we're seeing the deindustrialization of Germany. We are seeing the deindustrialization of the United Kingdom. And all the subsidies, free money that the governments of Europe give its citizens to buy gas, to buy heating oil, to buy gasoline and whatnot, it's not going to matter, because at the end of the day, it's not an issue of not having the money. It's that there's no supply. There's no supply of gas. They had cheap energy from Russia for years, decades, in fact. And because of the sanctions, they literally cut off their nose to spite their face. And no amount of money is going to cure the fact that there is simply not enough energy to go around in Europe this winter. So to your listeners, if you're in Europe, I would tell you that you have to stock up on firewood, heating oil, whatever it is that you use, because it's going to be a very ugly winter. And that's what I have to tell you here from the front.
Well, that cyber attack failed because Gonzalo can just keep talking. He's got so much, so wise is he. He was able to cover for the fact that I was temporarily taken off the air. I'm only joking. I don't know if it was a cyber attack. I've absolutely no idea what it was, but I definitely disappeared from the mother of all talk shows. But Gonzalo, great sport that he is, kept on keeping on and is still there now. Gonzalo, I just wanted to make a couple of comments on the tremendous report from the front that you gave. First of all, it seems unlikely to me that the Russians will allow themselves to be defeated in Kherson. After all, as you say, it was so vital for the dam. It was the first place they gave out the Russian passports. Their reinforcements are arriving, presumably from the mobilization that they have done. And although the numbers you gave us earlier are big, and of course they're very, very serious, particularly the casualty numbers. But, you know, if they've got 30,000 soldiers there, well, if Russia can't field 40 or 50,000 soldiers to hold on to Kherson, questions would have to be asked about them. So my instinct tells me that Russia will turn Kherson into a Stalingrad.
Well, what happens in modern warfare, what we're seeing is that, there comes a tipping point moment where, and insofar as an offensive is concerned, there are so many soldiers being thrown at you that sometimes it's just inevitable that you have to pull back. And it's not that you're weaker or that you're quote unquote losing. It's just a smarter thing. For various specific operational reasons and tactical reasons, you sometimes want to prevent any small salient of your own men being captured, cut off from the main grouping. So it's reasonable and rational to pull back, and basically it's the Muhammad Ali rope-a-dope strategy of just leaning back on the ropes and letting the other guy tire himself out until he's absolutely exhausted, and then you just wake up and knock him out. And so this is a rope-a-dope strategy that the Russians are carrying out. I'm thinking that viewers our age, I'm in my early 50s, we all remember Muhammad Ali fighting against George Foreman, and that rope-a-dope strategy, where it's basically you're fighting but defending, and you're letting the other guy tire himself out. Yeah, that's what the Russians are doing. Now, the other thing that's going on is that the partial mobilization. You have to understand that when they called up 300,000 troops, and I personally believe it was probably higher because of anecdotal evidence and just the general movement in society in Russia, it's probably a lot more. I'm guessing it's closer to 500,000. The actual number has never been actually released by the authorization that the Russians signed, insofar as this is concerned. That part is classified. So anyway, the point is, these people who were called up in mobilization, they are not taking those civilians, giving them a week's training and sending them to the front in Ukraine. No. They take those men, they gave them a week or two of refresher training, because all the men mobilized are former soldiers. They were in the army. And they are sending them to other units within Russia, far from the combat, to relieve combat troops there. And those combat troops who are already in place, already up to snuff insofar as training and equipment is concerned, those are the ones who are being sent to the Ukrainian front. And already it's credibly estimated that about between 60 and 80,000 men are in the region of Kherson, Russians, from this mobilization. So they've already made a massive move already. Okay, and so you have to understand that in modern warfare, you can, in any kind of industrial warfare, really, it's perfectly fine to give up territory, because as Clausewitz teaches us, you don't fight terrain, you fight armies. What terrain you capture doesn't matter. What matters is that if you destroy the opposing army. And that's what the Russians have been doing very systematically from the very get-go of this conflict, especially after the breakdown of negotiations in March, early April. You see, the Russians have deliberately been aiming to degrade the fighting force of the Zelensky regime. It is credibly estimated by Colonel Douglas McGregor, who's been keeping a very close eye and somebody who would highly recommend that you follow. He's the only dissident American officer who is saying what is more or less happening here in Ukraine. And he credibly estimates that about 100,000 Ukraine soldiers are dead. And likely that same number, if not more, of wounded, incapacitated. So the original army is gone. And so, this is, I believe, and other people seem to agree with me, that this is basically the Kiev regime's last stand. This is like the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, where during the winter and into January of 1945, the Germans threw everything they had at the Allies on the West, and they exhausted themselves. And after that, they had no more army left, no more gas in the tank. And it was only 3-4 months later that the Allies were in Berlin. And it seems to me that this Battle of Kherson is that final bulge in this war. And frankly, they are throwing away the last of what they've got. And the worst part, the thing that really drives me crazy, that I find is just immoral and despicable, and I'm sorry for using such language, but it's the truth. It's immoral and despicable that they are throwing away the lives of these men just to score a political victory so that it helps Joe Biden and the Democratic establishment get a few more votes in the midterm election. It's all politics. It's not because they think that they can actually win, because they know that they can't. It's over. It's been over for weeks now. And all of these men who are dying for nothing, it's that. They are dying for nothing. And that's the tragedy and horror.
Well, they're
And
not
the men
even,
who have made these
Gonzalo, they're
decisions are
not
evil.
even, Gonzalo, they're not even dying for votes for Joe Biden, because all of the signs are that Biden, the Democrats, are going to get the mother of all beatings in the midterm elections in November. There was some hope a few weeks ago amongst Democrats that they could limit the losses, but it now looks, according to the betting markets, the polling, and the individual statewide polling, all indicate a wipeout of biblical proportions. So these men's lives are being sacrificed for a political purpose which isn't even working for Biden. How about that then?
Well, George, you see, you are a much more idealistic man than I am, because me, the cynic, I think of myself as pragmatic, but maybe what I'm about to say is deeply cynical. I think that the Biden administration is going to outright try to steal this election. I think that there's going to be gross electoral violations in this coming election, and they will try to sweep it under the rug, as they did in 2018, as they did in 2020. And I am not confident that it will be a straight election. And I would suspect that there's going to be such shenanigans that it will throw the outcome into serious political turmoil. I cannot believe that I'm saying this. I have never seen any kind of lawlessness as we are seeing now with the Biden administration, so I couldn't put it past them. I mean, something that if you told me this 5-10 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it. Now I do believe it, because of the actions of the Biden regime and how the Biden regime has politicized the FBI and other security agencies in the United States to politically persecute dissident voices. Today, or yesterday was it rather, a writer, I don't have his name offhand, but he was a writer writing about the evacuation of Afghanistan and the whole withdrawal of last year. He was visited by the FBI. He abruptly resigned from his position and he's disappeared. This is the kind of thing that we used to see in totalitarian states, and we're seeing it in the United States, of America, with the Constitution, First Amendment, all that stuff. And we are seeing open and grotesque political persecution of the government against the people. And we are seeing similar things going on across Europe. We are seeing huge protests across Europe by the people with just grievances, and they are being maligned, they are being repressed. The fact of these protests is being censored. You know, the West is dead. In all of the virtues and all of the principles have been thrown away.
Even worse, Gonzalo, even worse than being repressed, they're being completely ignored, as if their demonstrations, their protests didn't even happen. Orwell, thou should be with us at this hour. But Gonzalo Lira was, and what an hour it turned out to be. Thanks, Gonzalo, for filling in for me in the mother of all talk shows.